Hi everybody, and welcome back to this edition of Inside Sports. I'm your host, Chris Marks. Today, talking about horse racing right here in the state of Maryland, as well as nationally. Triple Crown coming up here in the next couple of months. And I'm pleased to be joined by Ted Black, the president of the Maryland Racing Media Association, for the second straight year. Talk about that.
Thanks for having me on, Chris. Yeah, actually, every year we have our elections in January. As you recall, January 2012, I was elected president for the first time, and yeah, we had a good year in 2012. The crab feast went really well, so we had our elections again January 2013, and you know, they voted me back in, so quite a privilege to get reelected.
And what do you guys have up on the horizon here for 2013 in your second year?
Well, actually, we had the Maryland Racing Media Handicap a couple Saturdays ago at Laurel. That went really well. Oddly enough, this was the year that Mike Pons, who's our treasurer, was up for presenting the trophy. And just so happened that he had the best filly in the race. Country Life, he was part of Country Life Farm. They had the best filly in the race named Moon Filly. She happened to win the race for fun. So to sort of take the awkwardness out of the situation in the Winner's Circle presentation, I had Frank Vespi, who's our vice president, you know, make the presentation to Mike, so he wouldn't have to just stand there and hold the trophy and give it to himself, so to speak. So that went really well. And down the road, you know, we've got you know, basically the scholarship fund, the Backstep Scholarship Fund, and of course the Crab Feast in the fall. So those are pretty much the highlights for us during the year, and hopefully most of us will get out there and cover the races at Laurel and Pimlico. Let's
talk about that. When do those races normally run at Laurel? When do they normally run at Pimlico? And what can fans expect when they go up there to watch these races?
Well, Laurel, you know, since the slot money has started to kick in, it's really helped boost the purses at Laurel, and I'm sure it'll help at Pimlico as well. There's typically a stakes race every weekend, you know, on Saturdays at Laurel. Pimlico is going to have a full list of stakes, including obviously Preakness Day, the day before on Black-Eyed Susan Day. There's tons of them, you know, those 2 days. You know, and pretty much it's boosted the Open Stakes, the Maryland Bred Stakes. So the quality should, you know, start to improve, you know, overall. But Laurel runs through, I believe, Saturday, March 23rd is their last day. Then they move to Pimlico. And from what I've seen, Pimlico is going to run from late March through Belmont Stakes Saturday this year. I think they preempted the meet a little bit early last year. But with the additional revenue and the expected horses on hand, they're going up through Belmont Saturday this year, just for the live cards.
How many races per day at each event? And what days do they normally run on?
Typically at Laurel, it's been Wednesday through Saturday. And you know, from what I've seen, it's usually Georgianne can fill either 9 or 10 races a day. Yeah, she'll try to have more on the weekend, you know, when you have the stakes race. So, you know, in order not to weed through your horse population too quickly, you know, you can't run too many races or have too many days. But at this point, it looks like they should go 5 days a week, at least through you know, Belmont Stakes Day.
Okay, so we have the Triple Crown coming up here pretty soon. Talk about, you know, some events leading up to that and some maybe good horses that we can expect to see.
Well, obviously the preps are getting in full gear right now, Chris. You know, last weekend you had the Santa Anita, a race at Santa Anita called it San Felipe. Baffert, you know, Bob Baffert, who's always got a string of horses that are geared up for the Triple Crown. He had the favorite in there named Flashback. That horse got in a speed duel with Golden Sense, who was Doug O'Neill's horse. And of course, remember, Doug O'Neill had I'll Have Another last year, win the first 2 legs of the Triple Crown, and unfortunately had to scratch out of the Belmont. Those two got in a speed duel early and pretty much set up for a horse named Hear the Ghost, trained by Jerry Hollendorfer. It was his first time going 2 turns and first time in at that distance, mile 16th. And you know, he picked up the pieces and ran them down. Looks like he might have a future. And down in Florida, pretty much one of the big buzz horses right now is named Verrazano, trained by Todd Pletcher. He won the Tampa Bay Derby. Looked pretty good doing it. Sat just off the leader. And when jockey John Velasquez, you know, pushed on him at about the 8th pole, he responded, won by about 4 lengths. It was again, like Hear the Ghost, it was his first time going 2 turns and a mile 16th, and looked pretty professional do it. He's 3 for 3, and I'm guessing his next spot is probably going to be the Wood Memorial up in New York, the first Saturday in April.
Now, it's been a long time since the horses won the Triple Crown, 1978 affirmed. We had Al have another last year, give it a go. Do you think he could have won the Belmont had he not been scratched?
You know, I didn't like what I saw of him coming out of the Preakness for a couple of things. You know, him and Bodemeister hooked up in a dramatic stretch duel, as you saw in the basically last eighth of a mile in the Preakness. From what I saw from I'll have another in the lane. I didn't like the way he changed lanes a couple of times. You know, he was in and out, and then you know, he nailed Bodemeister on the wire, and about a quarter mile through the turn in the gallop out, you know, Bodemeister was probably 2 or 3 lengths clear of him. So there were a number of signs there indicating that, you know, maybe he was you know, about tapped out at that point with the 2 prep races that he had leading up to the Derby itself, and then the Preakness, which was a hard race. There was enough indications there that the Belmont was probably going to be a little taxing on him, and I thought he was going to get beat there. I hated to see him come out of the race because obviously it's not exciting if the horse just isn't in it.
A lot of horses won, not a lot, but there was more Triple Crown winners before 1978. 35 years now since we've had one. What is the reason why a horse can't win those 3 races?
You know, that's a good question, Chris. You know, first of all, in the 70s, yeah, you had a slew of them. You know, you had Secretariat in 1973, and then you had Seattle Slew in 77, and he was undefeated when he did it, and then affirmed, beating Alydar in all 3 of them. And going into the series, oddly enough, most people thought Alydar had the best chance of winning the Triple Crown just on his breeding, and you know, he turned out to be clearly the better sire of the 2 down the road. But since then, you know, the emphasis really has been on speed. It's been on horses being, you know, primed for the 2-year-old races, and you know, and then in the 80s, a lot of investors from overseas, you know, came in and bought a lot of the top stallions to either to race, you know, the horses that they produced overseas, especially going long. I mean, the European races are primarily on the grass, and they're primarily longer races, 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles. You know, and beyond. So those that end of the breeding pretty much got weeded out overseas, and here we were left with a lot of horses that are bred primarily for speed and not as much for stamina. And typically, you just don't see horses going into the Triple Crown races with as much foundation anymore. You know, you'll have, for instance, Verrazano, perfect example. Didn't race as a 2-year-old last year. He's 3 for 3 right now, but again, you know, he had no starts under his belt at age 2. And a lot of horses typically take that same route. You know, there are a few that get geared up for some of the fall races in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, but a lot of the horses now will sit and wait until after the Breeders' Cup to make their career debut, and some of them will just wait until the spring. So you just don't see a lot of horses with as much foundation under them anymore. You know, and the breeding end of it has been more for speed than it has been for stamina.
You touched on something a little earlier in our conversation, and that was about slots and how that has improved the purses at some of these races at Laurel and in Pimlico. Talk about how that's had an impact on the racing industry here in Maryland. Well,
you know, unfortunately, for probably 10 years, it was detrimental, simply for the fact that Maryland didn't have slots approved for any of the venues. You know, in the mid '90s, Delaware got on board with slots for their tracks, Delaware Park for thoroughbreds, and their 2 harness tracks, Dover Downs and Harrington. And then Charlestown approved slots, and so their purses, you know, skyrocketed as soon as they started to have slots at there and at Mountaineer Park, at the other track up in West Virginia. And for a long time, you know, Maryland had to compete with the fact that the other tracks had slots and they did not, and as the purses climbed at those other tracks, you know, you saw the quality horses go to the other tracks where the money was, and of course the quantity, you know, started to vacate to some extent. So it was a tough road for the Maryland horsemen for a long time, because everything had basically worked against them. The other tracks had slots, they could offer better purses, and Maryland did not have slots, and you know, the purses suffered, and the quality of racing suffered. So at least when slot money finally kicked in, after slots were finally approved and the slot money finally kicked in, now we're starting to see a little impact of the slot money going into the purse accounts, but it's been a long struggle. It's probably been 10 years overdue at least for that to happen.
And since it's kicked in, are some of the better horses bred here in Maryland staying put in Maryland and racing in these races?
Well, you're definitely going to see them stay and race in Maryland. I mean, with the stake schedule that Georgianne Hale's put together this year for Laurel and Pimlico, what you're seeing is a lot of races that are basically before were $50,000 and $60,000 stakes are now set at $125,000, and of that, $50,000 comes from the Maryland Breeders' Fund. So if you have a good horse that's Maryland bred and he wins one of the open stakes races on a Saturday for $125,000, that horse actually does get 60% of the pot. So he'll get the full $75,000. So that should entice the local homebreds, and the Maryland breds to stay in those races and compete in those races. And the other aspect of not having slots for all those years, Chris, was the breeding industry, did start to decline. You had a peak of 3,000 live foals in Maryland in 1985, and then in the past 5 years, it hasn't hit 1,000. So the breeders were, adjusting to the fact that, unfortunately, the horses they produced could not race for as much money, and when they went to the sales, we're not going to fetch as much money as the sales because the short-term and the long-term benefits just were not there, while slots were not there.
Okay, well, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to have the Gaudettes on. They train horses right over at the Bowie Train Center. You're staying here with me, and we're going to be right back just after this. Please stay tuned. More on Maryland horse racing when we come back.